Thank you. It gives me great pleasure to speak to everybody today. Uh, so far away, but so I hope everybody can hear me. So my name is Paul Stapley. I did my initial training in France, between Paris and Dijon, and then I trained in Canada for 4 or 5 years. Um, I worked as a professor in McGill University in Montreal, and I've been in Wollongong now for about 8 or 9 years. Um, so I'm going to talk about many of the activities that we do in our laboratory, some of the data from Sergio's work, and some of the data from the main thematic of the laboratory. So where we begin is trying to understand the postural adjustments that accompany voluntary movement. Okay, so this slide here is some very traditional, classic study by a group in Paris who studied the postural adjustments that accompany voluntary movements of the arm. Okay, so traditionally the role of these postural adjustments has been described as stabilizing posture when you move your arm. But the problem with this is that if you simulate this voluntary movement using a very simple model, studies have shown that you don't actually need this postural muscle activity to stabilize your body. If you have a very simple model of the body, the movement of lifting your arm and decelerating your arm at the end will automatically stable your body. Okay? So the question is, does an arm movement actually perturb the body? Okay? And this has been the theme in my laboratory now for about 15 years. So the main problem here is that you have similar muscular activity in different movements, whether the goal is to move forwards or to stand still. And the paradigms that have been used are not really perturbing paradigms to posture. So what we've tried to do, what I'm going to talk about today then, is during goal-directed movements, does the postural activity assist the production of movement rather than ensuring stability? I'm going to show that postural muscles participate in the movement of the whole body. I'm going to show that if you change instability, this muscle activation doesn't change its nature. Okay, so it always plays a role of movement production. And at the end, I will talk a little bit about some of Sergio's data and the data that we're working on now, which shows an interaction between movements of the eyes and human balance. So in my laboratory, we have a system of lights targets. People have to stand in the center of these targets, and the lights light up. So the very simple instruction to the subject, when they see a target, they just reach out and point to the target. We can study the forces produced at the ground. We can study the kinematics in 3 dimensions. And we can study up to 32 muscles in the legs, in the arm, and most recently in the trunk. So these studies have been published in journals, Journal of Neurophysiology, Experimental Brain Research. So we've been quite successful with this paradigm. So this is quite a complicated slide. Yeah, sorry. But if you look at this side of the slide here, what this shows is the muscle activation in the legs, the lower limbs, so different muscles of the lower limbs, before the person begins to move to the targets. Okay? And if you concentrate only on the black dots here, you can see that in the period before the onset of the movement, which would be about here, the brain organizes the activation of this muscle, of these muscles, in a very uniform way. Okay, what does that mean? That means that the brain is able to organize depending upon the direction of movement, okay, so that different muscles participate in different directions. Okay, this plot here shows that the center of body mass always travels in the direction of the movement of the arm. So imagine that this is, you're looking down on the person who is moving. As they move in different directions, the center of mass displaces with the movement. So this really means that the brain is not trying to stabilize the center of mass in one position. It assists and it makes the center of mass move in different directions with the arm. So it makes us think, well, what is the real role of this muscle activation before the arm begins to move? It's definitely not to stabilize the center of mass. What it really does is it produces the dynamics to go in different directions. So the message of much of this work is to say that posture and movement of the arm are the same thing. You cannot separate these two things. So all of this muscle activation can be summarized into 2 or 3 functional groups of activation. And the goal of these functional groups, is to make the body move in the direction of the target. Okay. Sorry about the complicated slides. So we've also studied this activation in the trunk muscles, so in the muscles of the upper body. Okay, so why is that important? That is important because the trunk is the heaviest segment of the body. So if the brain has to stabilize the body, it will stabilize the heaviest segment over all the other segments. Okay, so we were able to identify a very similar organization of this muscle activation to 3 functional groups, even in the trunk muscles. Okay, so normally this activation of the trunk muscles would be to stabilize that very heavy segment. But even in these trunk muscles, the goal of the muscle activation is to move the trunk in different directions. Okay, so if you look again at the center of mass, this center of mass always travels in the direction of the target. Okay, so it really suggests that regardless of which muscle you look at, in the period before you begin to move, the goal of the muscle activation is to move the whole body to the target. Yep. So, what's the conclusion? The conclusion here is that muscle activation that happens before movement doesn't have a goal of stabilizing the body. It has a goal of moving the body in different directions. Okay. So we tried to change a little bit the constraints of the movement. So we started a paradigm in which the goal of the movement changes unexpectedly after the onset of the voluntary movement. So, for example, here you can see that people have to start by doing a movement to the central target. And at different times during the movement, this target light will extinguish, go out, and another target will illuminate. Okay, so it means that the brain has to reorganize the postural adjustment to go to the new target. So what this paradigm enables us to look at is the goal of the muscle activity in the legs, is that for stabilizing the body, or does it participate in the adjustment of the arm muscle? Okay. No, I can't play. Sorry, I can't play video. So what we were able to do was to look at the muscle activation in the legs at the same time that the movement of the arm changed. And the basic question is, does this postural muscle activation occur before the change in arm movement? Or does it occur after the arm movement has been modified? If it occurs before the arm is changed in direction, we can conclude that this postural muscle activation participates in moving the body to the new target. If the postural muscle is corrected after the arm is changed, we can conclude that that postural muscle participates in the stabilization and not the movement. Okay, so again, sorry, but a very complicated slide. Okay. On this side of the slide, you have the muscle activation that accompanies a simple reach with no correction. Okay, so the light comes on and the people reach and touch the target. Okay, you see that there's some muscle activation that precedes the onset of the movement, and then muscle activation that accompanies the movement when it finishes. Okay, this is a movement where the initial light in the middle lights up, and then after 400 milliseconds of a voluntary movement, the light turns off, and one at 45 degrees lights up. Okay, so you can see in the gray shaded area, muscle activation in the legs. On the side opposite to where the hand goes, activates to push the body to the new target. So first, we could identify corrective muscle activation in the limb opposite to the target. And second, we wanted to know, does this activation occur before the activation of the arm muscle or afterwards? Oops. So we did a very simple calculation. We calculated the times of the correction of the leg muscle and the time of the correction of the arm muscle. And any of these values that are positive mean that the leg muscle activated before the arm muscle. So we could identify 3 different leg muscles, and each of these leg muscles activated before the arm muscle did. All of these muscle activation occurred in the leg muscles before the arm, in all of the targets, all of the perturbed targets. Not only that, but if the target change occurred as the arm was accelerating or decelerating, it was still always the postural muscles before the leg muscle, the postural muscles before the arm muscles. So the postural muscles always occurred predictive of the arm muscle. And the role of the postural muscle activity was to drive the body, send the body to the new position. So we went on to do more of these experiments because we wanted to ask the question, does the brain always plan the posture to be predictive of the arm muscle? So previously we had only these targets, and now we added some more targets, which meant that the body had to rotate to the new target. This is whole body, this is arm kinematics to the different targets. Okay, and this is approximate time that the light changed. And these are the times when the arm trajectory changed to the new target. Excuse me. So what we were trying to do was to say, is there a generalized strategy that the brain uses to change posture for any direction of movement? So these are some statistics. We had many trials. The target perturbations were mixed with the change in target time within the voluntary movement. Okay, so you see that these histograms show that we had a wide range of perturbation times across the 6 targets and across the voluntary movement. So some of the perturbations occurred very late in the voluntary movement, and some occurred very early in the voluntary movement. Regardless of which side the perturbation occurred, so again, it's a similar plot to before. This is a simple reach movement with no perturbation. This is a perturbation to the ipsilateral side, to the side the same as the moving arm. And this is a perturbation to the side opposite to the moving arm. So ipsilateral, contralateral. So for the ipsilateral, it's the same pattern as before. The left leg muscles activated to move the arm to the right. And for the contralateral muscles, the right leg muscle activate to move the arm to the left. So it's essentially a generalized strategy. Much data. I'm very sorry for this, but the main message of this slide is that you can look at contralateral and ipsilateral perturbations. You can look at any combination of arm muscle and leg muscle. So here, for example, biceps activation, shoulder anterior deltoid with left tensor fascia latae or tensor leg muscle. Regardless of any relationship between arm muscle, shoulder muscle, and leg muscle, all the average data shows a positive value. And this means that the leg muscle, the postural muscle, activates always before the arm muscle does. So this means that regardless of the position you go, ipsilateral, contralateral, regardless of the time that the perturbation occurs in the voluntary movement, the postural muscle always occurs before the arm muscle. So that means that the brain is planning the change in movement in a way that is predictive of the direction that you move it. So it means that posture is an essential component of voluntary movement. It's not too fast, it's good. Okay. So the next question then really is are those results dependent upon the fact that we're standing up? In other words, if we do something sitting down or standing up, does the fact that you're standing up determine how you move to different positions? So we did a very simple experiment. We wanted to know do the constraints of balance, okay, and this leads to Sergio Jimenez's work. Do the constraints of balance determine the kinematics of voluntary movement? Because essentially, when you're sitting down, you have no constraints of balance. So the brain can concentrate on moving the arm without having to calculate the constraints of standing up. In standing, the brain has to plan posture and movement. Okay, so what we did is we had people sitting and standing to do simple reach movements straight ahead. Okay, this is finger position from one position to another. This is velocity of the finger. This is sagittal plane trajectory for sitting, standing, and this is endpoint error, so where the finger ends. So we did it in reaching with no perturbation, and we did it in perturbations when the target changed position by 60 degrees. And the main result on this entire slide is that if you compare stand and sit in the different conditions and the different results, nothing changes. So standing really is not a perturbation to voluntary movement. So we'll come back to this difference between sitting and standing when we get to look at eye movements. So now we ask the question, instead of changing position of the target, what happens to the postural adjustments if you change balance conditions? So I think some of you may have listened to the presentation of Alexander Stamenkovic. This is Alexander's work that he did in the lab. So what he did was he looked at arm movements in different postural conditions. Sit, stand, standing with the feet close together, and standing with the feet on a beam, a very thin piece of wood. So it gives you a very small amount of support. Now, the important thing here is that if you follow the theory of postural adjustment, changing postural constraints, so making it more difficult to stand up, should theoretically change the postural adjustment. If you follow the theory that the posture is important for stability. Yeah. So these are trajectory of the finger for 5 targets: ipsilateral, contralateral, sit, stand, narrow, beam, in the 4 conditions. There's quite a lot of variability in the way that people move. Okay, but average arm trajectory is very similar, regardless of postural constraints. However, the center of mass, so these are graphs of the center of mass, how the center of mass moves with the arm movement. So very similar to the slide that we saw before. So again, if you follow the theory of anticipatory postural adjustment, if you increase the postural condition, the brain should minimize, make very much smaller the movement of the center of mass. Okay, so this is sitting, this is standing, this is having the feet narrowed, and this is on a beam, on a support. So again, regardless of the postural condition, the center of mass always moves in the direction of the target. In fact, if you make this section bigger, you can see that even in the period before the movement begins, the center of mass begins to move in the direction of the target. So it's very strong evidence to suggest that the brain is not really interested in keeping balance during the movement, during the early part of the movement. It just wants to send the center of mass in the direction of the target. So this is just the muscle activation showing that regardless of the condition, you have a very uniform postural activation. It's always moving the body in the direction of the target.
Yo lo vi ayer también salir al gallo con esa.
So what Alexander did here was he quantified the movement of the center of mass at different times during the movement. So here you have the phase before the movement begins. Here you have the phase as the arm accelerates. And here you have the phase for the whole movement. So you can see that even in the conditions where it's very imbalanced, the center of mass moves forwards. So the brain is not trying to minimize the displacement of the center of mass. What it wants to do is to move the center of mass with the body. And the activation of the postural muscle are highly correlated to the movement of the body and not stability. So what's the summary of this section? In terms of understanding posture, traditionally, we can study it in two ways. The first way to study posture is to put people on a platform that moves. Okay, so when you move somebody standing up, the person detects the displacement of the support surface and activates the postural muscles in feedback to bring the body back to stability. If we follow the traditional theory of feed-forward postural adjustments, everybody has said that this activation in the lower limbs minimizes the displacement of the center of mass as the arm moves. What we've managed to show in our group is that there's no clear difference between segments that move and postural adjustments that stabilize. Okay, in these movements, it's all part of the same plan. So the brain plans movement and balance as one thing. Excuse me. So to finish, more recently, we've begun to look at how the brain coordinates eye movements and balance. So the question is, why is this important? This is important because elderly people in particular fall in different situations where they have to coordinate the arm, the eye, and movement. So perhaps if there's a delay related to eye movement when you're standing, it could explain why elderly people fall over. So this is Sergio Jimenez's work. So what we did in the lab was we had a paradigm called single step or single perturbation or double perturbation. Okay, so in single perturbation paradigm, central light lights up and then another light will light up. So the eyes reflexive in a reflex way shift from here to here reflexively. In a double step, as the eyes are shifting to the target, this target will go out, will extinguish. And a second target will light up after 200 milliseconds. So what's this paradigm examining? This paradigm is examining the process that takes place in the brain, in the visual cortex and the superior colliculus, to reorganize that planned eye movement to another target. This is important because it really examines, this paradigm examines and perturbs areas of the brain that are responsible for eye movements and balance. So these are average, this is average data. This is from experimental brain research in 2016. These are young people, so under 35 years, and these are older people. So if you look only at the reflexive data, older people are more variable, but they move at approximately the same speed. However, if you look at the young versus the older people for the double step, so in other words, when the brain has to reorganize reflexive shift to the new target, the older people are delayed, but they're even more delayed when they're standing up, which you don't see in the young people. This is the data. So here you see reflexive, single step, young, old. So there's no significant difference with reflexive eye movements, regardless of posture. But if you look at the double step reorganization trials, older people are always longer, but they're even longer when they're standing up. So what you can do is you can predict delays in the eye movement for sit and stand. There's a very strong relationship between eye shift and there's a strong relationship between the first and second eye shift. And this relationship shows that when the elderly are standing, there's a significant delay in the change in eye movement. So you can predict, based on our data, you can predict delay with age. So what does this mean? This means for us that one reason that elderly people may fall over in different situations of daily life, for example, walking upstairs, reaching to, reaching to pick something up, moving the arm and the eye in the hand, in the standing position, the instability may be explained simply because of the interaction between eye movement and balance. So at the moment, we are working on another paper that uses a task called anti-saccade task. Anti-saccade task. So in this task, the instruction to the subject is when a target lights up, you must look to the opposite side. Okay, now this is an important task because it identifies how the brain inhibits a response. Yeah, so this is a very difficult thing to do. To inhibit a planned response to a target is a very difficult thing to do. So we did this in sitting, standing, narrow stance, tandem stance. Because if you increase the postural constraints and you ask people to do an anti-saccade, it will tell you about how the brain integrates balance and eye movements. So in the beginning, what we did was we tried to identify people who showed delays in anti-saccade tasks only sitting, only in the sitting condition. Yeah. So we have two groups. One group are the people who don't delay, have no delay, versus pro anti-saccade, so they can do these things at the same speed. And the second group who show significant delays in anti-saccade versus pro-saccade. So we could identify two groups. These, if you separate the data for these two groups, the group that showed delay between anti and pro-saccade showed significant delays across the different balance conditions. Whereas the group that showed no significant difference in sitting also showed no difference if you change their balance. So some people are sensitive to balance and eye movements, and some people are not. If you take these two groups, you can actually predict how much imbalance occurs, so how much the center of pressure moves under the feet, based on the difference between pro and anti-saccade. Okay, so for example, in this group here, you can predict how much they're imbalanced based on the relationship between pro and anti-saccade. So at the moment, we're writing a paper to show that there's a predictive relationship between eye movements and balance. So the conclusions here, the elderly are not necessarily slower on reflexive eye movements to one target. Posture doesn't affect single step eye shifts, regardless of age. but the elderly are affected by standing. So if you put the elderly in a standing position and you study their eye movements, they're much slower. So there's an interaction between eye movements and balance. And at the moment, we're using the anti-saccade task, which tells you about inhibition in the brain, inhibition of a planned response, to further explore this relationship between eye movements and balance. So that's my presentation. I collaborate with Alexander. I collaborate with people in the UK, with Sergio, Jonathan Schemmel, and Mark Carpenter at the University of British Columbia. So I can try and take some questions if you have questions.
Muchas gracias, Paul. Haremos una ronda de preguntas. Ya pueden hacerla por el micrófono en este caso, pueden activar su audio, o ya sea en el sentido de... O lo pueden, ¿no es cierto?, traducir, ¿no es cierto?, Jeffrey. Agradecemos, ¿no es cierto?, la presentación de Paul. Hay una pregunta en el chat. Miguel Pino. No sé si lo puede ver.
Yes. Is it Miguel Pino? No.
Sí, Miguel Pino está primero.
First, sorry, Jeffrey. First, Miguel Pino is asking about,
I understand that your group has presented strong evidence that postural muscle activity precedes and accompanies, but what is the role of this postural muscle activity after movement? Very good question. Yeah, so the postural muscle activity that I describe, I really focus on the muscle activity before the arm begins to move. Okay, because traditionally, this muscle activation, everybody says that this makes stability. It stops the center of mass moving. But we have shown that this is not actually true. But to answer your question, the muscle activation, as you reach the target, as you get to the target, that's the muscle activation that makes you stable. So in the beginning, the brain doesn't care about stability. It just moves your body to the target. And at the end, it produces the muscle activation to stop yourself at the target. Does that answer your question, Miguel?
si puedes activar, Miguel, si quedó alguna duda.
Both approaches may coexist when thinking. Yes, absolutely. Both approaches do exist. But it's an important point, because traditionally the tasks that have been used to study this phenomenon are the wrong tasks. Okay, so with this task, at the beginning, the arm movement produces a perturbation to balance. And at the end, it stabilizes balance because it decelerates. So if you model it, a simple model will show you that if you have no postural activation, you won't fall over. So my opinion is that we've used the wrong tasks to study this phenomenon. So there's some other question.
Jeffrey, Francisca, ahora sí.
Pourquoi? Yeah. Good question. So when we begun these series of experiments, we didn't know what they would do. So you could hypothesize that in the beginning, maybe the people will change their arm and then update their balance afterwards. So we were interested in understanding how the brain organizes this. And to answer the question, it's clear that young people, they will use their posture to help them change direction of arm movement in a feed forward mode, predictive mode, not a feedback mode.
O reactiva también.
Yeah. So it's a part of a dynamic model of movement. So young people are able to estimate the effect of moving the arm on the body very well. So they use their posture to assist their movement.
Y eso independiente a la dirección, como también a la perturbación del centro de presión. Eso téngalo en cuenta también. El adulto joven mantiene la misma latencia, los mismos valores, ya sea de movimiento, tanto el reaching como también los movimientos de corrección en línea, los mantiene estables.
Yvonne is asking why different surgeries could, yeah. Okay, can I show you? Hang on, let me just show you something that we've been doing lately.
Yeah.
Let's see, projects. Just give me 2 seconds.
Paul, did you understand the question?
Yeah. What type of training can be used to improve this?
Yeah.
Okay, Yvonne, are you watching? So this is a robot arm that we've built in the lab. And the objective of this robot arm is to train the arm muscles to overcome a perturbation. Okay, and what we want to do with this robot arm is to use it in stroke patients that have deficiencies in their arm or in their leg, to train and to induce plasticity in the brain, in the arm muscles and the leg muscles. So if you listen, when the arm gets to the middle of the movement, there's a perturbation. Okay, so I'm going to play it again. Just listen very carefully to the motor. And you can see on the muscle activation that there's a correction in the triceps muscle. So to answer your question, what we're doing at the moment is to use this perturbation paradigm during arm movements with stroke patients, because this device can evoke muscle activation in the upper limb and the lower limb. So you rehabilitate the arm movement and balance as one thing. So that's what we're trying to do at the moment with this paradigm. Good question. Thank you. Mini best. So she mentions the mini best test. Now, the mini best test is the best test that you can use, because the best test uses principles of feedback control and feed forward control. So I think what she's asking is yes. Yeah. Es una ambición. So my understanding of the best test is it incorporates anticipatory postural adjustment. Yeah.
Alejandro Villalobos. Alejandro, bueno, Ivonne, bueno, junto con saludarte, Ivonne también. Ivonne, conocemos hace muchos años. No sé si quiero aclarar la pregunta, principalmente eso.
Alejandro.
Yeah. Alejandro.
I think he's asking a question about sports training and posture.
Yeah. He asked about the concept of the core abdominalis core in the training of the central core in all sport, because that's maybe it's massified in training all kind of training or sport training. Yeah. What do you think about
the interesting thing is with the reaction time tasks that they use with sportsmen? The interesting thing about these paradigms is that they're training visual motor coordination and balance at the same time. So I can't answer the question 100%, but I would imagine that these reaction time tasks are very good because they're training eye movements, balance, reaction time, and trunk muscles. And those trunk muscles have to activate predictively based on the direction you're going. So I'm not sure that answers the question, but
Alejandro. Claro.
Juan Jose, thank you for the interest in the present. According to your evidence, postural and arm muscle activation are coordinated simultaneously. Could this be interpreted in favor of one unique model? Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. It's one model. Yeah. So it's a model of posture and movement that can evaluate the dynamics of your arm movement and program your posture to move with your arm.
Enzo Valeria. Enzo. Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. Again, a very good question. I think the brain begins to worry about balance once it's programmed the onset. So before you move, the only feedback that you can get, or the only information, is based on experience. So the experience of me picking this up, I've done it hundreds of times. So the brain can evaluate the dynamics of that movement even before I move. As soon as I begin to move, it gets feedback from the arm that it uses in the model to update the model. And it's, as you say, it's a parallel model of movement. It's predicted movement and actual movement that are compared. Does that answer your question? It's a good question.
Luis Mella. Igual a ti, Ivonne. Luis Mella asked about the participation of the balance of perturbation balance on this theory with respect of the feedback and the feed forward to the restraint of the posture maintenance.
Yeah. Sorry. Repeat the question. 2 seconds.
Yeah. Which one is the participation of the reaction of the balance on this theory when the feedback and the feed forward are acting during the constraint from the constraint to keep the balance or keep the posture. How all the theories of posture are acting when for example the feedback and the feed forward are acting in the same when you are keeping the posture.
Well, it's a difficult question to answer because you have numerous sources of feedback. Okay, so when you begin to move, you have proprioceptive feedback. You also have visual feedback of peripheral vision of your body. And you have feedback from your feet through the forces. So it's quite a difficult question to answer, but the brain has to integrate all that feedback and compare it to a dynamic model that it has already in the brain. You can't separate these two models completely. They're completely linked. Feed forward and feedback. You're always integrating feedback. But I think the important model is Daniel Wolpert's model of estimation and predictive models. It's the closest it comes to understanding voluntary movement. So the idea is that the brain has an estimation of the feedback required. Okay, it produces a movement, and as you're moving, your brain is comparing the estimation with the actual feedback, and any difference is an error that it has to correct. So I'm not sure that answers your question, but I think that's what I understand as dynamic control.
Lo que quiere decir Paul, sorry Paul in Spanish, es que si bien en la parte de modelos o de experimentos tú puedes separar el modelo predictivo y el reactivo, en este caso el feedback y el feed forward, en lo natural o en el momento de actuar naturalmente es muy difícil separarlo porque ya sea cualquier tipo de movimiento siempre están combinados, ya sea el feedback, feed forward, incluso el control paralelo, que es aquel que es en línea. Todos se combinan a la vez cuando tú aceleras o desaceleras en cualquier movimiento, ya sea dinámico, siempre están presentes para controlar la aceleración, para desacelerar. En todo momento tienes esta combinación de modelos. Y eso es lo que tienen que también entender, que hay una separación si bien es experimental y teórica, porque a muchos nos enseñan que el feedback es siempre de esta forma y el feedforward siempre es predictiva, pero en todo momento estamos trabajando, por ejemplo, en movimientos conscientes, sobre todo, con un modelo predictivo y un modelo de tipo reactivo. Ya siempre estamos controlando, sobre todo para que se optimice el movimiento, como dice Paul, de manera natural. Siempre están los dos combinados. Muy difícil dejarlos por separado. As you say, Paul, it's quite difficult to separate in natural movements, to separate the feedback and the feed forward. Just in experiment, you can separate it, but in the normal, in the daily activity, it's complex. It's quite difficult because both are integrated in your brain to control any kind of movement.
Plus, you have many different forms of feedback.
Yvonne, again. He asked again about how you suggest a strategy for training all elderly person for example, for keep their balance. How do you have any idea about how could you suggest whether it's the best training for this kind for keep the balance in the elderly, also how they prevent the fall or the range of fall in the elderly?
Okay, so the first way I'd answer it is that when we do the same target experiments with elderly people, they don't show a predicted model of postural adjustment. In other words, when the light target changes, they move their arm and then they change their posture. So this introduces a delay in time. Okay, and that delay in time, even if it's 100 milliseconds, means that they can fall over because they haven't predicted the posture that is adequate to move their body. So in my opinion, if you use tasks that require a coordination between upper limb, estimating the weight, moving from one position to another, you're training balance in the elderly in a way that is more valid than simply using a perturbation. Because using a perturbation is only feedback. It's only detecting that there's an imbalance. It doesn't require the elderly person to predict their own movements and their own perturbations. So I know that my wife's a physiotherapist and she uses tasks where the elderly have to move from one step to another. They have to move up steps or down steps and predict step length and gradient and things like that. So I'm not sure that answers the question, but I think as therapists, we need to use tasks where elderly people need to predict their own movements. Sergio, I have 2 minutes and I have to go to another meeting. Sorry. Sorry.
Sí, yo creo que la última pregunta del profesor Marimán.
Yeah.
So Amanda has a nice question. I work with blind children.
Yeah.
Have you ever? No, I haven't. But I'd really like. The problem is in these paradigms, you have a visual representation, but there's nothing to stop us doing experiments where we practice a movement and they reproduce a movement in different directions. And it would be interesting to see if blind people use a predictive mode of control. because vision of the moving arm should be part of the dynamic model. So if the children grow up with no vision of the arm, how do they construct that predictive mode of control? So it's a very interesting question, and I think Amanda should come to Australia and study it.
Exacto. Ok, Wilson, yo creo que cualquier
No al
consulta,
tiempo, agradecer a todos los participantes, agradecer a Paul por
Gracias.
también responder por
Todos.
su presentación, por su, en este caso, por la respuesta también. Yo sé que muchos queremos preguntar muchas cosas, pero no al tiempo también del profesor. Agradecemos a todos y no sé, algunas palabras de cierre para el profesor Paul o Sergio.
sí, well, Paul, we're glad to give your webinar on his speeches. Tremendous. So, yeah, all the Chilean folks are very thankful for this speech. So, thank you so
It's
much.
been
and
a
have
great pleasure
great
for
day.
me. And
See you,
after
Paul.
COVID, I will come to Chile.
You are mostly invited to Chile.
All right. Thank you to everybody for joining.
Muchas gracias a todos por participar. También lo invitamos a la actividad de la Asociación
Thanks,
Chilena.
Jeffrey. Okay.
See you, Paul. Yeah, thank you.
Adiós.
Sí, muchas gracias a todos por participar. Lo invitamos también a ser parte de la Asociación Chilena de Ciencia del Movimiento, en las redes sociales, ¿no es cierto? Facebook, Instagram, y sobre todo las siguientes actividades que vamos a ir realizando. ¿Ya? Muchas gracias a los profesores que participaron, Ivonne, ¿no es cierto? El profesor Marimán, que lo vi por ahí también. Muchas gracias por sus preguntas también. ¿Ya?
Sí, cualquier duda, consulta, estamos también, bueno, Wilson, yo, la Universidad de Atacama, bueno, y también por parte de Wilson, la asociación, y cualquier cosa se contactan con nosotros, si es que quedaron alguna duda. Lo otro también, el video va a ser subido, ¿cierto, Wilson? ¿Qué preguntan?
Sí, yo creo que va a ser subido, se puede compartir. Ya, yo creo que no habrá problema. Yo creo que lo vamos a subir en este caso al YouTube, en este caso al departamento de Kine, ya, el departamento de Fisiología de la UDA.
Ya, y todavía estamos en pañales, chiquillos, con temas, sobre todo en adultos mayores. Estamos muy en pañales, en fase experimental. Así que...
Muchas cosas que aún se siguen.
Sí,
todavía que hay que estudiar.
Sí, y que estén muy bien.
Chao. Chao a todos.
Chao.